distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking the Sri Lanka Army for the invitation to this important event. It is a privilege and a pleasure to have the opportunity to address this audience. I would like to share some of the experience of the International Committee of the Red Cross on the topic of internal displacement. This year, we mark the 20th anniversary since the United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. It is a document that provides a rights-based guidance on preventing, responding, and addressing internal displacement. This anniversary, in fact, gives us an opportunity to take stock of what has been achieved, but also to look forward and to analyze what still needs to be done. It is clear that concrete commitment and action by states affected by displacement, donors, humanitarian organizations, development actors, all are needed. A collective effort is needed to address internal displacement more effectively. Let me share some figures with you to remind us of the scale of the issue. These come from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. By the end of 2017, some 40 million people were internally displaced by armed conflict and violence. This includes 12 million people alone last year. Many of them have been displaced, in fact, for several years. Another 19 million people were displaced by disasters in 2017, most often weather-related, and we've heard this morning as well, and Dr. Halliday mentioned it again. Some of them were displaced only temporarily. Thankfully, they were able to return home, but it still had a profound effect on the lives of those who have been displaced by weather-related hazards. These figures show that we remain unable to prevent new displacement and to solve current displacement, as millions of people displaced by war and violence are displaced for extended periods of time, sometimes because conflicts last much longer than they used to, but also because there might be obstacles to local integration or return. We at the International Committee of the Red Cross certainly do not have all the answers. What I would like to do is share some of our experience, which is based on the work that we've done both with internally displaced people, but also with host communities. He often very generously offered their homes to those who have been displaced. Displaced people are among the most vulnerable civilians. They often find themselves in precarious conditions with no or limited protection and insufficient access to basic goods and essential services. A few words on preventing the emergence of conditions that lead to displacement. And here I'm focusing on conflict-related displacement. This is the topic that the ICRC is most familiar with. Let's take a step back. Why are people displaced by armed conflict and violence? Some flee before they're being directly exposed to conflict, sometimes to be spared from violence, sometimes because of the disruptive effect of conflicts and violence on essential services, the economy, and livelihoods. Some of them may just send their families away and stay behind to work and to look after their assets. The audience in this room will be very familiar with the critical importance of respecting international humanitarian law in times of conflict. Even when international humanitarian law, or IHL, is respected during a conflict, displacement occurs. Violations, however, of IHL can cause even greater displacement, as civilians may be targeted directly by parties to the conflict. The most effective way to prevent displacement induced by conflict would be to prevent conflicts and violence. But when conflicts do occur, a better respect for international humanitarian law helps to reduce the scale of displacement. As we know, forced displacement is prohibited under international humanitarian law, and parties to a conflict must strive to limit the effects of their operations on civilians. This can contribute greatly to limiting displacement. And outside of armed conflict, the respect for international human rights law is equally effective. How to respond once internal displacement occurs? A better respect for the legal frameworks ensure the protection of those who are displaced. It can ensure their safety and access to assistance. It can help prevent secondary displacement. Many times people are not only displaced once, but several times, and every episode of displacement increases the vulnerability of people as they lose more assets, their networks, and their livelihoods. Displacements creates needs for internally displaced, but also host communities, and we heard the example of Syria. Neighboring countries have been extremely generous in accepting Syrian refugees. Unfortunately, the humanitarian response, and there I include also our response, tends to fall short of meeting these needs. Many are left to fend for themselves, facing progressive destitution, sometimes having to resort to harmful coping mechanisms. For example, sending their children to beg in the streets, joining a criminal gang or armed groups. The response fails to meet people's needs in part because of the scale. We heard it's 40 million internally displaced people. Sometimes they're difficult to reach in areas affected by conflict. Sometimes there are legal or policy environments are not conducive to attending to the needs of internally displaced. And in that regard, the inclusion of a section on IDPs and refugees, so IDPs, internally displaced persons, and refugees in Sri Lanka's National Action Plan for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights is very welcomed. Finally, humanitarian organizations may lack the resources, may not coordinate operations appropriately, or fail to reflect on longer-term solutions. So we see that this must be a collective effort. Solving internal displacement is a challenge. Displaced persons often remain displaced for longer periods of time, more so today than in the past. This is linked to the duration and chronic nature of armed conflict and to a lasting violence. But not only. Sometimes they may not be able to return to their places of origin. What we need to do here is integrate broader development and peace-building programs and take into account the needs of internally displaced persons. Not only their immediate needs, but also their long-term needs. Creative thinking is critical to address displacement, and a more effective interface ensuring coherence and complementarity between humanitarian and development actors is key. How does the International Committee of the Red Cross respond to displacement? We intervene, in fact, in different phases of displacement. Wherever possible, we seek to prevent displacement from occurring by reducing some of its causes. In armed conflict, where international humanitarian law is often violated, that can be a cause for displacement, and we promote greater respect for international humanitarian law by all parties through confidential dialogue, but also through training and other activities. We assist communities by restoring essential services disrupted by the conflict, for example, when they lose contact with their loved ones. We usually focus our activities on internally displaced persons outside of camps or hard-to-reach areas because of our comparative advantage in terms of access and our ability to work with both displaced persons but also the host communities because often they too suffer. But also we support states with the development and implementation of legal and policy frameworks on IDPs. I would like to briefly pause and speak about urban displacement, as this is a phenomenon that we are increasingly seeing, because violence and conflict has become increasingly urbanized. Let us just think about the Battle for Mosul. Little is known about people's experience on displacement in urban settings and outside of camps. Most of the response, in fact, focuses on camps rather than outside. In light of this, we have just completed a study on urban internal displacement that will be launched shortly. In a few words, again, people flee to cities hoping to find safety, but also access to services, livelihoods, social networks, and often to find support from relatives and friends, but also to receive humanitarian assistance. Many settle outside of camps, they're hosted by communities, they're renting accommodation, or are housed in self-made shelters. They receive often limited support, but if they did, they could often in fact return to an income-generating activity and thus regain autonomy and dignity. For host families and communities who often show great solidarity in receiving displaced persons, this solidarity can also become a burden, especially when it is protracted. Shortcomings in the humanitarian response is often attributed to the scale and complexity of cities, and because humanitarian actors in fact lack the experience in operating in cities. Reliable data might not be available. They also result from the fact that the response is commonly built on unverified assumptions. For example, that internally displaced persons settling outside of camps are harder to find, or that they're better off than those reaching camps. To improve the response, we need to better understand the situation of internally displaced in cities and the impact that their displacement has on host communities, and to address both by engaging at different levels. That might be at the city level, with mayors, with neighborhoods, households, and individuals. We also need to ensure that the priorities and concerns of affected populations are taken better into account, that they are reflected in our response. We quite often assume that we know what internally displaced persons need, but we rarely actually ask them. That is a critical fact. We must better articulate short and long-term interventions by approaching emergency support and resilience building simultaneously and not sequentially. So all of those needs, the short, mid, and long-term, are equally addressed. Cracking the urban displacement challenge is essential, as the world will continue to urbanize, and we have to become better at responding in urban environments. Another issue that has been of concern to the International Committee of the Red Cross is the preservation of the humanitarian civilian character of sites where internally displaced people are housed. There are specific challenges related to preserving the humanitarian civilian character of what we call generally IDP sites that will be of interest to you. Not only the Sri Lankan army, but also others in this room are countries that contribute troops to peacekeeping operations. And quite often, your operating environment will include so-called IDP sites. When people are displaced by armed conflict, flows may include combatants. Some may infiltrate these internally displaced persons camps. This can lead to direct attacks on camps, to forced recruitment, to sexual violence within the camps, or to diversion of humanitarian aid and access problems. These sites should be placed where people can be assisted in safety, and their civilian and humanitarian character should be preserved. Parties to the conflict must take all feasible precautions to avoid, or at least minimize, harm to civilians living in sites and damage to sites or civilian objects located within the sites. Parties to the conflict must also take all feasible precautions to protect the sites under their control against the effects of attacks, notably by avoiding locating military objectives inside or in the vicinity of the sites. This means that military troops, including peacekeeping troops, should remain outside of camps and sites to avoid turning them into military objectives. Now, this is easier said than done, and we recognize that. It entails screening and separating combatants from civilians. This requires a comprehensive approach that builds upon relevant legal frameworks. It builds also on cooperation amongst humanitarian actors and with other concerned entities to maximize protection. Over the last year, we at the ICRC have reflected together with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees on addressing these challenges. We also involved the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in the process because they play, as I mentioned, a critical role. We also guided relations, but they displacement. In many countries, legal and policy frameworks might have to be developed and implemented. This is a first step in ensuring a consistent, coherent, predictable response to displacement. Respect for international humanitarian law can contribute greatly to reducing the scale of displacement and ensure that those displaced. In this regard, armed forces play a vital role in ensuring that their members respect international humanitarian law. We recognize that balancing security considerations and humanitarian considerations can be a real challenge. In several places, displaced persons coming from a specific area might be seen as a security threat, and they might be separated or isolated. But in general, those persons should not be treated as a security threat. Again, it's about balancing humanitarian needs and security considerations. It is a collective effort to prevent internal displacement, but when it does occur, it is also a collective and shared responsibility to alleviate the suffering of those who suffer internal displacement. Thank you very much for your attention.